All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're going to get started. I know some more people are hopping in, but welcome. I'm Glenn Hurwitz, the founder and CEO of Mighty Earth. As background, Mighty Earth is a global advocacy organization that works to drive outsized impact for nature and climate. We have a wonderful panel today. I'm going to provide a little bit of background, and then we're going to dive in, and we'll have an option for an opportunity for questions afterwards. We're here to discuss how lawyers and campaigners are working together and getting results in driving transformation of the world's largest meat company, JBS, that's setting the stage for a broader transformation of that industry. While we at Mighty Earth work all over the world on important issues, we've made the transformation of the meat industry our flagship campaign. The meat industry causes more deforestation than the rest of agriculture combined and spews more climate pollution into the atmosphere than all the world's cars, trucks, and ships. This is an even bigger deal than EVs, and they're a pretty darn big deal. Our model is typically to focus on the largest company in the industry and create a perfect storm of engagement and advocacy to set a new standard that drives enormous change. This approach has helped yield 90% declines in deforestation for commodity agriculture in Asia and Africa. It sparked science-based decarbonization in the steel industry and many other climate and environmental breakthroughs around the world. But to do this in the meat industry, we need JBS to change. JBS is the biggest meat company in the world. It has the climate footprint equivalent of the whole country of Spain. Its livestock methane pollution exceeds that of France, Germany, Canada, and New Zealand combined, or a total of more than half of all US agricultural methane emissions. It is the biggest corporate driver of the destruction of nature, period. Our recent analysis found that this single company was linked to over 1 million acres of deforestation. That's an area 25 times the size of Washington, D.C. But we are not here to punish JBS, but to change them. Our goals are to drive an 85% reduction in deforestation across the meat industry by 2030, reduce agricultural methane emissions by 30% by that date, improve treatment of wildlife by cattle ranchers and allow wildlife populations to restore, and drive a long-term shift to plant-based and other alternative protein that has a radically smaller impact on the planet than industrial meat. The protection of nature, to a great degree, hangs on the decisions of JBS executives and the courts and regulators who oversee them. Other meat company CEOs see the pressure JBS is facing and rightly wonder, there but for the grace of God and a big environmental campaign, go I. And they're right. We've been pressuring them with an amazing set of indigenous and civil society allies from many directions, and that work is yielding results. Carrefour, the largest supermarket chain in Brazil, and we believe the largest customer of JBS beef, responded to our campaign recently by announcing that it had persuaded the company to discontinue business with 177 beef suppliers in Rondônia state in Brazil linked to deforestation. This is a big deal and sends a powerful signal across South America that deforestation can prevent companies from gaining access to markets, even previously unscrupulous actors like JBS. JBS gets a lot of attention for its operations in Brazil, but it's not just a Brazilian company, even though its global growth has been heavily subsidized by the Brazilian state. Only approximately 15% of its revenue comes from Brazil and about 55% from the United States. JBS wants access to US markets and now US capital markets. It is working to list itself on the New York Stock Exchange that would give it access to tens of billions of dollars in new capital. Based on its current trajectory, that would mean more deforestation and more pollution. It also raises serious governance and corruption issues. The SEC and DOJ in 2020 fined JBS $256 million for bribery and corruption. As such, we believe this is the single IPO with the largest stakes for the climate ever. And it's also an opportunity to bring change. The efforts you're about to hear about have already helped secure a delay in JBS's IPO. That means their environmental and corruption issues are costing them billions of dollars. And we understand from JBS insiders it's causing them to take action on stopping deforestation, tackling methane, and scaling all proteins. That action is far from sufficient, but it is starting, and we need a lot more of it. It's not the only thing that's driving change. We were proud to support New York Attorney General Letitia James as she has continued her heroic work by suing JBS for fraudulent marketing. These efforts are working, and I think there's a lot to learn from them. And now, before we start in with questions for our esteemed panel, I'm pleased to introduce a special video from US Senator Cory Booker. He's famous, he's charming, he's courageous, and despite all of that, in my view, he's still probably the most underestimated political talent in the United States. But JBS doesn't underestimate him. He understands the central importance of transforming the meat industry to nature and climate. He's brought savvy to the campaign, working with us to marshal a bipartisan coalition of Republican and Democratic senators to publicly ask the SEC to scrutinize JBS planned IPO. Please go ahead.
Hey everybody, it's Senator Cory Booker. For too long, giant multinational meatpacking corporations have been undercutting our domestic farmers and ranchers while fueling deforestation, undermining human rights, and devastating our climate and natural resources. We need to make sure bad actors are held accountable. And I'm proud to work in a bipartisan manner to crack down on these practices. That's why it was unacceptable to me that the Brazilian meatpacker JBS, which has one of the most egregious track records on deforestation in the Amazon and was embroiled in one of the most shocking international corruption scandals in recent history, has announced that it would seek an initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange to reap the benefits of the world's largest financial markets. Earlier this year, I led a bipartisan group of senators pressing the SEC to decline JBS's IPO, given that history of corruption and greenwashing. Thanks to that pressure, JBS was forced to delay their listing, and I'm hopeful that they are beginning to take steps towards good governance and meeting their climate commitments. Look, we can make a difference. I'm excited by this win, which would not have happened without the efforts of Mighty Earth, who are true champions in this space and work tirelessly to keep up the pressure on companies like JBS in order to eliminate deforestation in our global industrial food system. We can do this. So please consider me a partner in this mission to end deforestation and ensure the fair treatment of workers. It is all about justice, justice for all.
Excellent. Well, thank you to Senator Booker for all of his amazing work through the years on these and many other issues. With that, I wanted to turn over the panel to give some introductory remarks. First, I'm very pleased to be joined by securities lawyer Kevin Galbraith of the Galbraith Law Firm in New York. Kevin has been working with us for nearly 2 years on JBS and other issues where we found leverage with the SEC to drive action on climate change and brings a long history of working on securities law issues for the public interest. So Kevin, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Glenn. Great to see everybody today. As Glenn mentioned, Galbraith Law Firms in New York City, been practicing about 20 years, focusing exclusively on financial services and regulatory work. In the whistleblower context, our practice encompasses both traditional whistleblower work, including corporate insiders, and more importantly for today's discussion, non-traditional work with subject matter area expert people outside of companies, analyzing the facts and bringing those facts to the attention of the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. Been working with Mighty Earth and other nonprofits on a 2-track strategy, 1 being legal and 2 being deep media engagement, right alongside Mighty Earth's incredible press shop. We've had substantial successes. The first effort we undertook together was against Japan's infrastructure bank, which raised $500 million from U.S. investors with the promise that no proceeds would fund coal-fired power plants. Turned around and announced the funding of 3 coal-fired power plants. The foreign minister was grilled on it. They announced later they were halting construction on, I believe, 2 of them, at least 1, and I believe pausing on the second. And then in the JBS context, we've been engaging on both the whistleblower side and in challenging and requiring or requesting that the SEC deeply scrutinize their planned IPO. We've gotten major traction, which I'll be happy to talk about more. Our goals are accountability for JBS, transparency, and as Senator Booker and Glenn have mentioned, really deeply limiting their horribly negative impact on the climate and deforestation. It's been an absolute privilege to work alongside the excellent team at Mighty Earth, Glenn and his entire team of subject matter experts, as well as the amazing press shop. So thank you. It's a privilege to be here today. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and look forward to diving in a little bit more. Please, the rest of you don't have to praise us. That's very nice of you, though. But Carol, next we have Caroline Perlo of Fama Recapital in Sao Paulo, who's the head of climate stewardship. This is a great, very exciting fund that is working to decarbonize Latin American carbon majors. And I'm so excited about the fact that they exist and seeing some of their early work. Caroline.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I'm actually so glad we're here to discuss the meatpacking industry and its impact on deforestation and land degradation and climate change, because conversations around climate change have often focused too much on energy transition, while greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation related to the agribusiness sector and to food production in the global south are often overlooked. So I think this JBS listing and the discussion here presents a great opportunity for us to reflect on the significant impacts of this industry on climate change and biodiversity loss. And as an asset manager, I am very pleased that this also gives us the chance to talk about the role of financial markets and investors in promoting more ethical and sustainable practices in the meatpacking sector. As you mentioned, at Fama Recapital, we launched the LATAM Climate Turnaround Fund recently, where we are investing in the big CO2 emitters in the region. And as shareholders, we are engaging collaboratively with these companies to drive this change, including in the agribusiness sector. So I'm happy to be here and learn with you and share with you all on this very important topic. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Also pleased to introduce Andrew Shallett from Green Century Funds. Green Century has really been the greatest champion among institutional investors for driving climate action broadly, but also work on stopping deforestation and making agriculture sustainable. They're seen as a real leader among other very large pension funds, other institutional investors in driving change with many different companies. So Andrew, look forward to your introductory remarks, but also, if you could touch on how investors are reacting to JBS in particular, that'd be really welcome. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you. So Green Century was founded in 1991 as an environmentally responsible mutual fund. We were one of the first families of fossil fuel-free mutual funds. And it's really in our DNA to engage with companies, to push the companies that we work with, that we invest in, to improve their environmental practices. Over the years, we've led hundreds of engagements, sometimes on our own, sometimes working with other investors. We always rely and depend on outside organizations like Mighty Earth, who can provide expertise and guidance to us. So thank you, Glenn, for having Mighty Earth fill that role in a number of cases. Over the years, we've gotten hundreds of agreements with companies. Just in the last year, we engaged over 50 companies and got, I think the end was 26 agreements, getting companies to agree to improve their climate practices, reduce plastic pollution, report on their impacts on nature, et cetera. So we're used to talking to companies. And the thing that these discussions rely on is the companies being good faith partners in those dialogues. They They aren't usually happy to hear from us, but they're polite and they're honest, and we're able to engage with them. JBS is set up to be the opposite of all those things. It's shown through its actions and through the structure of its filing that it does not intend to engage with the broader community. It does not intend to take any guidance from the investor community. And investors are very concerned about that. We're in the process of collecting signatures for a letter to the SEC from the investment community, and we're seeing a strong response to that letter. We expect it to go out in the month of August. So I'll leave it there. There's so much to say about JBS, so I'm looking forward to the questions. It really is the perfect storm of problems at every level with this company.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. Caitlin, Changing Markets, Caitlin Smith is a senior campaigner at Changing Markets Foundation, which has worked to expose greenwashing and drive change on agriculture and many other issues, and it's been a long-term partner of ours. Caitlin, really interested to hear about the work that you're doing broadly, but also your new report, The Merchants of Doubt, about how the meat industry is undermining action on climate.
Thanks, Glenn. And yeah, thanks to Mighty Earth for hosting this discussion today. We're really glad to be part of it and be here with you all. So yes, Changing Markets campaign to shift corporate practices away from unsustainable ones to more sustainable ones. And one of our biggest campaigns at the moment is on methane emissions reduction. So JBS have featured pretty regularly throughout that campaign in our various investigations as the largest meat company, and because animal agriculture is the biggest source of man-made methane emissions and is responsible for a third of global heating today. So obviously incredibly important that we try and tackle this. What we've uncovered in our latest report, The New Merchants of Doubt, is really echoing what Caroline was saying, actually, that the agriculture industry has so far been left off the hook of emissions reduction accountability. And this is something really shocking considering how much they contribute to global heating today. And in the report, we use this term agricultural exceptionalism to describe how some of that is playing out in different contexts across the globe. And so this is kind of all carrots and no sticks approaches to policy making, where we're seeing lots of greenwashing from companies, narratives being pushed to try and maintain the status quo. And in previous reports, we've looked at JBS's emissions in particular. They are the largest of 15 global meat and dairy companies globally. As you mentioned, Glenn, already, it's larger than France, New Zealand, Germany, and Canada combined, which is, you know, pretty massive, and larger than some oil companies like ConocoPhillips and Occidental as well. So it's really important that we kind of put the pressure and take a good hard look at companies like JBS and the actions they're taking to keep polluting. So I'm being happy to be here to talk more about that later on in the discussion as well.
Great, thank you. And next up, we have Raissa Pina, a PhD researcher in anthropology at the University of Brasilia. Raissa's research explores the meat industry in Brazil and is focused on JBS and others. Raissa, really interested to hear your thoughts in general, but also, JBS talks a lot, like many large agribusinesses, about advancing public interest goals, like feeding the world. But your research has exposed how it hasn't always translated into broader social progress. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your findings.
Sure, Glenn, thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure to be here today among such qualified panelists. I've been researching JBS's globalization process for my PhD thesis, and the reason that I had for choosing this case to study comes from my personal life. I'm based in Oxford now in the UK, but I was born in the same city where JBS was founded, right in the center of Brazil. At the beginning, it was a small family business, but it has grown to be a global leader of the food sector. And my argument, as you mentioned, is that JBS's success is a consequence of an alliance between one family, the family Batista, national policies, and the financial market that benefits also foreign states. And I hope I can share a bit about this with you. When I started my investigation, I was curious to see the impacts of corporate success in a broader social development picture. And my research findings show that Brazil has not benefited from JBS in any way. The country still ranks as the most unequal in the world in terms of wealth inequality, and indicators of poverty and hunger have increased in 11 of 12 Brazilian cities where JBS is heavily involved. At the University of Brasilia, I'm working with a non-traditional anthropologic field interested in mapping elite global networks to identify inequalities and dependencies in the global south. But the story of climate injustice also holds another important aspect, which is the strengthening of poverty and the accumulation of wealth in a few hands. I'm looking forward to discuss further this matter with you today, but I will leave it to the next round of questions. Thank you again for having me, and over to you, Glenn.
Great. Thank you so much, Raisa. Kevin, let me go back to you. I think this legal work that we've done initially on the Japanese coal finance showed a model for success. I mean, that one we believe contributed to getting the foreign minister of Japan questioned, and then them withdrawing their financing from a number of Southeast Asian coal plants. And we've been trying to replicate this model in the meat industry. It is pretty innovative legal work. I'm curious how you see it driving impact both with the company and what you're hearing from other lawyers, that are looking at this work, and also what you're hearing from the SEC.
Great. Thanks for the question, Glenn. And I'm gonna take them in reverse order. Just starting with what I've heard from others in the legal community. Other attorneys have taken notice. There's no question about that. They've been very intrigued by our leading edge work. So we've heard from both prominent whistleblower attorneys within the community, as well as other public advocacy lawyers, both inside NGOs and also those in private practice. So as a result, we're now working with attorneys in North and South America, Asia, the UK, and France. So some of that is simply informational. We exchange notes, we share our model of how we've done this. Sometimes we formally team up and begin work on additional efforts. Our work is frankly becoming a model for effective efforts. And it is always about a team orientation, right? We work on the JICA matter with Japan's Infrastructure Bank. I believe there were a coalition of 5 NGOs that we worked together with, Glenn. And it's always, and so whether it's a large group of NGOs or it's co-counseling with other firms, it's always about a bounty mentality rather than a scarcity mentality. We are simply looking to get the work done. We are looking to drive this change in these critical areas, and it's working. As far as impacts, let's focus on JBS. We have every reason to believe that our approach to the whistleblower, which has now included both our original submission and either 4 or 5 supplemental submissions, including a very recent statement of facts, which is an exhaustive recitation of the company's misconduct. We have every reason to believe that we're getting major traction on the whistleblower front. And what that means is our ideal scenario is that they open a formal investigation and bring an enforcement action seeking both penalties, disgorgement, as well as some injunctive relief, possibly including what's called a D&O bar, where the SEC has the power to bar directors and officers from serving public companies. We believe that those on JBS's board richly deserve such a fate. And on the IPO front, we've gotten excellent feedback from the Division of Corporate Finance. I'm not going to get into our discussions that we've had with them in any specificity, just out of respect for the context of those conversations. But suffice it to say, they have been extremely encouraging and have told us to continue to bring to their attention and the attention of any division within the SEC any and all information that we have about unlawful conduct by JBS, such that the public can be fully informed about the truth of what this company does. Whether we can ultimately completely halt or prevent the planned IPO is an open question, but as Senator Booker indicated, it has been delayed multiple times. And from our side-by-side comparisons of the different registration statements that they've filed, we have forced major disclosure of things that the company would far rather the public have no idea about. So lots of impact, but a lot of work to go. Thanks for the question, Glenn.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and congratulations on all this work. Let me ask you a hard question, which is, there's been a lot of debate in the United States about what the SEC requirements on ESG are, and especially to what extent do they require scope 3 disclosure of impacts. That's third-party suppliers. This is a really important question for agriculture, where up to 98% of the impact comes from these scope 3 emissions. The SEC's ruling didn't really go in the direction we would like, where it would have required that scope 3 disclosure. And yet it seems like in this and many and other examples, there is potential to use the SEC's jurisdiction to drive action. Can you explain where you see opportunities, either with JBS or with other major polluters, to drive action despite this position from SEC?
Sure. And first, on the scope 3 piece, absolutely. The decision by the SEC did not go the direction we wanted it to. However, that does not foreclose the opportunity, because in the US, as articulated by the Supreme Court, a company cannot be required to discuss things that are not mandated by statute or common law. However, if they choose to speak on that subject, and here the example being scope 3, they cannot lie. So here JBS has chosen to discuss scope 3, and they have been deeply deceptive in their discussions of scope 3 emissions. So we still intend to hold them accountable for their misleading statements and omissions regarding scope 3, despite this regulatory the rule issuance. More broadly, accountability looks like disclosure, right? So that people actually understand the company that they're dealing with before they buy their shares, particularly institutional investors like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and others. Certainly Andrew's fund would not be pleased to know that a company like JBS was within its portfolio. So first, it's about accountability and transparency. And second, it's about, frankly, punishing the company to some degree, right? The SEC has an enforcement power. As I mentioned earlier, they can issue civil penalties, they can take injunctive action. On the IPO front, they can simply mandate an absolutely fulsome disclosure within their registration statement before they declare it effective and allow the IPO to go forward. And Glenn, just consistent with Mighty Earth's effort here, it is not just about accountability and transparency. It's also about driving material change, right? So you and your team engage deeply with the companies, including JBS, their chief sustainability officer, and others. And we know, and again, I'll leave it to you to talk about any details you wish to share, but we know that the legal efforts that we and others are undertaking are having real impact on the ground, whether it's personnel changes, the depth of engagement, and so on. I hope that answered the question.
Great, fascinating. Thank you. All right, let's move on to Caroline. You're in the investor community. Can you talk about how JBS is perceived in Brazil, and especially in the financial community? The Batista brothers, who own the company despite all the corruption, are back on the board. They seem to be engaging with President Lula, even as he is pressing the private sector to tackle Amazon deforestation. How is this all adding up? How is the company perceived, and where are the opportunities to drive change?
Thank you, Glenn. I think I'll just step back to tell you that there is a huge historic gap in Brazil that divides the agribusiness sector from the environmental community. But this gap has somewhat been narrower in the recent years for many reasons. And we're seeing actually more willingness from various actors in this ecosystem to engage in solutions for the traceability of deforestation, in the soybean, the meat industry, and including a lot of willingness by the main players, by the main meat packers. Of course, there's still a small number of players who are not interested at all in solving the problem, who are not engaged, and probably because they think they're not accountable for that. They have their backs covered by the major presence of agribusiness in Congress and even by the government. And I think JBS was one of these players. So when compared to its competitors, because JBS's competitors are more willing to change and to address the issue, JBS is not a choice in terms of responsible investment, because responsible investors know that they are not engaged. It's easy to do that due diligence. It's in the newspapers. And it's actually thanks to the work that Mighty Earth has been doing and other international and local organizations as well, and the media. So if they want to restore their image among this community, the responsible investment community, the environmental community, the press, they have a lot of work to do in terms of being open for engagement, because this is not what has been demonstrated so far.
Great, excellent, thank you. Andrew, you've been so immersed in the global institutional investor community. Could you talk about how the specific structure of JBS's unusual specific structure of JBS's IPO is causing investors to react?
Sure. There are multiple levels of obfuscation going on. Shareholders and shareholder voices provide important feedback to the company board and to company management, and can help companies make course corrections or consider factors that they wouldn't otherwise consider. JBS is putting a number of roadblocks in place for that, from the way the filing structured to the dual class of shares. So they're setting it up so that the shares owned by the Batista family will get 10 votes each, and everyone else's shares get 1 vote. And as a result, the insider effective ownership will go from just under 50% to around 85%, is the number I've seen. This has real impact, and investors hate it. And regulators have let things like this happen, but markets are not happy about it. And I just want to give some examples from the most recent season of shareholder filings at company meetings. Meta has a similar dual class stock structure. So Mark Zuckerberg's shares get 10 votes for as compared to the 1 vote that everyone else gets. This year, in 1 year, there were 5 proposals at Meta put forward by institutional investors, which would have gotten a majority vote if there was an equal playing field, but instead got very low votes because, again, Mark Zuckerberg voted against all of them. 2 of these were actually shareholder proposals about the dual class share structure. One of them would have gotten an 84% vote, but instead showed up as a 26% vote because Mark got to vote 10 times. There were votes on child safety. There were votes on risks related to AI. the fact that 84% of Meta shareholders, one of the largest, most successful companies in the world, 84% of the actual shareholders were voting against this process. This structure just tells you how much investors don't like it. And that's the course that JBS is pursuing, because they want to keep their heads down with the
Right.
business model that they know the world isn't going to stand for and isn't going to like, but they don't want to hear about it.
Right.
So they're trying to make sure they don't have to listen to anyone.
Absolutely. And I know, you know, the largest independent shareholder is BNDES, the Brazilian development bank that has been so important to JBS's expansion. And so this is going to be a key issue, because the question of whether or not they can use their votes for the dual listing resolution, as you suggest, is going to be a really big one. Let's turn to, and happy to dive in more on as we get into Q&A, but Caitlin, I want to turn to you. To talk a little bit about solutions. There are millions of cows on the planet producing a lot of methane. There's other sources of methane like rice, palm oil, mill effluent, and others. What are the most important things that we need to do to rapidly cut methane pollution and achieve an outsized win for the climate?
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so I mean, the science, I think, is really quite clear. Quite recently, over 200 scientists agreed that livestock numbers need to peak in high and middle-income countries by 2025 and low-income countries by 2030. The IPCC is also recommending dietary shift as well. And I think a really shocking stat for me anyway is that, you know, if we can continue on the same trajectory of livestock production that we're on, we're going to use up nearly half of the global heating budget. So even if we get rid of all emissions from fossil fuels, we're still going to exceed the level of warming that, you know, we've agreed to in the Paris Agreement. So it's really, really vital that we really focus in on that need to reduce herd sizes. And I think technical solutions can be part of that, but they are not a silver bullet solution. And companies like JBS are really pushing them forward and investing a lot in marketing to suggest that this is the way forward, but they're not actually putting their money where their mouth is to invest in changes in their supply chain or changes in their model. So in our report, we found that they're actually only spending 0.03%, which is so small, of their annual revenue into research and development for low carbon solutions. So it's quite clear that, you know, a lot of these companies are not really committed to taking forward the transition that needs to happen. So we need to see food systems transformation included in nationally determined contributions at a government level. We need to see support being in place for farmers to reduce those herd sizes and more sustainable methods like agroecology. And companies like JBS, they need to be really setting ambitious climate targets that needs to include absolute emissions, not just emissions intensity, which is what their net zero plan included. They need to have methane specific targets as well, and really clear trajectories for shifting away from reducing those, to shift and reduce those livestock numbers.
Thank you. I will say, you know, I think in all of our discussions with JBS, because we, you know, are trying to drive change with them, bring solutions to the table, they have expressed increasing openness about this, but we need to see results, because it's not just about, you know, making vague commitments, but actually driving very specific actions, whether it's deforestation or methane. Along those lines, Raisa, we've talked a lot about the United States and their leverage and how JBS is a really important company in the United States, even though it's perceived as a Brazilian company. I'm curious, though, if you could talk about what the role of the Brazilian government is, and perhaps in particular, the Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES, which is the largest independent shareholder of JBS and also has channeled about $6 billion of public finance to the company to fuel its expansion.
Yeah, this is a very good point, Glenn. Thank you. BNDES is indeed an important shareholder, not only because it owns the second biggest share or has 2 seats in the board, which means that the government participates in the decision-making of the corporation, but also because there's evidence that throughout this complex business-state relationship, BNDES sometimes play the role of holding JBS accountable for its negative actions. We can observe that inside the company, BNDES was responsible to claim for corporate compliance and professional governance in the past years. The bank also voted against the raise of executives' wages, and in 2017, it was against JBS's first move to go public in New York. This is a very old plan for JBS. In the past decade, there were an average of 400 shareholders attending the annual meetings, and the list of attendees included many foreign states as well, not only the Brazilian government. We can mention, for instance, 13 American subnational states, such as Florida, Washington, Connecticut, and others. These are states that are investing in pension funds for their public servants, or even making direct investments as states. And we observe the same practice among Canadian states, for example. Also, the European Central Bank also attended the shareholders meeting last year in a moment that Europe had just approved the anti-deforestation law, which is controversial. And we can also notice a long list of pension funds that benefit public servants in the UK or even in the United Nations. These shareholders pay attention on BNDES's behavior inside the company. Now with Lula back, the Batistas are more empowered. In the first IPO voting process inside the company that took place just among the board members, the two BNDES representatives were in favor of the double listing, but this can change in the shareholder assembly. One good advantage of having this public bank as a strong shareholder is that civil society can demand information and transparency through BNDES. Also, other governments, departments, and the press can question BNDES's behavior. And if the double listing is approved, the Brazilian state control will be weakened, and the little transparency that exists so far will be even more blurred. Coming back to your question, Glenn, by voting the deal down, BNDES will surely avoid the perpetuation of strong social inequalities in Brazil and worldwide, as we are talking about a corporation that wants to spread more and more its roots around the globe every day. And unfortunately, I imagine that everyone here in this call today might be consuming from JBS somehow. Even if you don't eat meat, they are investing in major vegetarian brands in Europe and the UK. They also are investing in cultivated meat or lab meat in Spain, and so on and so forth. They're investing in the fish market in Australia. So it's part, even though it's a Brazilian company, it's part of everyone's here's life. Thank you, Glenn. Back to you.
Right. Thank you so much. Really interesting. So let me shift to some of the questions we're getting in Q&A. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but let me zero in on one from Paulo Barreto, the great Paulo Barreto. Is there an estimation of how much money JBS is losing by having its New York Stock Exchange listing delayed? And you know, I don't know, Andrew or Caroline, if you could talk about, you know, how these dynamics usually work with how legal strategies or other campaigns, you know, may actually impact valuation and actions by companies. Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, no, that's outside my wheelhouse, so I'll pass on that.
I don't know if it's a tough question, I know. Does anybody want to take a shot at it?
Well, I can try. Actually, the only source I have here to answer this question is actually a study by the London School of Economics last year. It was released last year. It was actually a paper, but I know for a fact that it's going to be published in Nature very soon. A paper on the impacts of climate litigation on share prices of carbon majors, I think, across the world. There are not many cases of climate litigation against corporations and that had an outcome already, but this study tried to address that. And it was very interesting to know that there was an impact, that an impact was was bigger on the bigger emitters. I think was something around 6% after these companies were targeted by climate litigation. Actually, sorry, just coming back to that, it's not that these cases were trialed, but regardless of being trialed, I think just the fact that these companies were targeted by litigation cases had an impact in their valuation, in their share prices. So that's an interesting one. But unfortunately, we don't have that many assessments on that. And that's because, I suppose, litigation cases are still developing around the world. Although we do have in Brazil 85 cases already. And one in particular, very interesting, illegal action taken against a farmer in the Amazon region, where the federal government is charging this farmer a carbon price of 60 euros for each ton of CO2 emitted in a land that was deforested. And I think the land was like 5,000 hectares, actually. That was it's not the only case with that legal argument. There are, I think, already something around 20 cases on those lines. In this case, particularly that I'm mentioning, I think this was just one that had a ruling very recently where the assets of this farmer were frozen. There's a lot going on actually on climate litigation in Brazil that is worth the close monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a great question because it gets to opportunity cost. It's a little bit hard to define. I think what we can say is that we are seeing concrete actions from JBS, like the discontinuing of the deforestation-based suppliers, and also, something I see as a good thing, which is, JBS starting to invest in plant-based and alternative protein, like Raisa was saying. I think the challenge is that it's too small, and that's a great example of it. It's just 1% of their business, and almost serves as greenwashing for the 99% that is industrial meat. And so this is the dynamic. You see results because they're worried about the potential threat of losing business or losing, billions, trillions of dollars, access to trillions of dollars in capital markets. All right. Next question from Daniel Bernard. If JBS was to list on the New York Stock Exchange, what key ESG commitments would you demand that JBS commit to? Caitlin, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I think there's, a few of the things that we talked about a bit earlier as well. We need to really make sure that they're fully disclosing all of their emissions, that they're being clear and transparent about their reporting in terms of their kind of slaughter numbers every year, all these things that help us calculate even what those emissions are. And to have that really independent verification as well of their climate reporting alongside a methane target. So I'm sure many of you will be aware that they recently had their net zero plan removed from the Science Based Target Initiative. And when we looked into this in our report, what we found was that they weren't in line with the high-level expert group on net zero. So this is an expert group that was set up at COP27 to look into net zero plans and make sure that they are really accountable and transparent, and they're not being used for greenwashing. And JBS's plan at the moment doesn't include Scope 3, and it doesn't include absolute emissions. So these are two, I think, really key things that they could do to start to improve their climate record.
Thank you. All right, from Rebecca Kurland, how does the fact that JBS has debt listed on the New York Stock Exchange affect its chances of a dual listing? Is there any precedent of a company with listed debt being denied an IPO? If anybody knows the answer to that. Kevin?
Because of how the inner workings of the SEC go, there's actually very, very little data available on this. What we do know from our discussions and interface with the Division of Corporate Finance, which is responsible for either declaring the IPO registration statement effective or not. What we do know is that they are all about disclosure and transparency. We don't know for a fact if companies with debt have had IPOs denied. However, The other thing that I can observe more generally is that when companies are not deeply scrutinized, whether it's for a debt offering or listing its shares, they tend to, and I hate to say this, this is not meant to be disparaging of the SEC, but they tend to sail through. So when the spotlight is not turned on somebody, whether it's trying to raise $500 million of debt, $3.2 billion of debt in these so-called sustainability-linked bonds that JBS sold to U.S. investors, when the scrutiny is not there, the prospectuses and registration statements sail through and are relatively easily approved. When there is scrutiny, we have multiple delays. We have bipartisan groups of senators coming together to oppose it and to require additional scrutiny. So as with some of the other work that we're doing here, we're probably breaking some new ground. So if we end up being the first to prevent an IPO from going forward from somebody who's previously been approved to issue debt, then fantastic. We've gotten the attention of Division of Corporate Finance, and that's the mission.
Great, thank you. And you know, SEC and DOJ have both issued public blistering indictments of JBS when they issued their huge fines for corruption. So I think that gives some rationale for them to deny it. And this is, you know, this is to a degree uncharted territory. From Dorian Nunez, how can New York Stock Exchange be pressured to not go ahead with the JBS listing? Are they concerned about their reputational risk? Andrew? Kevin?
Go ahead, Andrew. Or I'm
Yeah,
happy to...
no, I'll pass on that one also.
Sure. So that one's pretty simple. I mean, yes, New York Stock Exchange is a company that can be targeted to some degree. However, they really do take their marching orders from the SEC. If the SEC declares a registration statement effective, they will sell the shares. Although I love the question, and it certainly raises yet another possible angle of pressure. So it's a great thought. Clearly, the SEC will be making the ultimate decision here, but to the extent we could exert additional pressure on other stakeholders, love that idea. I saw in the chat there was another question about what about the law firms and the investment banks? Can't we pressure them as well? And again, the answer is yes. This is a multi-front battle, and they all ought to be held up to both public scrutiny and legal pressure to the extent possible.
All right, from the legendary Peter Goldmark, I think this question is probably best suited for Raisa. One of the things that makes your work so important and the JBS focus so remarkable is the failure of so many governments to probe and investigate wrongdoing in the agribusiness area and the widespread prevalence of government corruption. Are we seeing any change in that situation, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is a complex question. I will try to respond. I just wanted to go back a little bit in the ESG question, that we not rarely we lose sight of the S of ESG. We lose sight of the social aspect. And I would like to highlight that both JBS and BNDES, they state on their annual reports as their own goals to also comply with some of the UN sustainability goals, which is besides environmental aspects, also to provide decent work, reduce inequalities, and also fight hunger. This is failing, as we can see. Regarding the question, Glenn, we see in Brazil now a very controversial government, because it also invests in I mean, we created like a minister for indigenous peoples. We have a strong environment agency, but at the same time, we see the government asking for tax-free for the meat corporations, or even President Lula going with ministers of state to a factory, a JBS factory in Campo Grande, wearing their uniform and celebrating the expansion of exports to China. So we do see some efforts from one side to comply with environmental legislation. The UDR was very important on this. We see some movements happening in Brazil, but as you said yourself, Glenn, we do need to see real actions taking place and real changes taking place, and this hasn't been there so far.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, to some extent, we've seen governments all over the world be hamstrung when it comes to tackling agriculture's climate impact by things like the Chevron Supreme Court ruling, just the stranglehold that agribusiness seems to have over government regulators, which is why it's often fallen on unconventional agencies or private sector pressure, public campaigns to drive change. All right, let's. There's a lot more questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them. So, final minute, Andrew. I'm curious where you see this going. The investors really now are a center of attention. What are their opportunities to drive action going forward?
Well, I hope the listing fails. We'll see. We're going to make our voices heard with the SEC, with that letter going out. If the IPO does go through, we will look to engage JBS to meet the just minimal standards initially of planning for the future, of putting the sort of infrastructure in place to manage their sustainability impacts, to manage their climate impacts. Most companies of their size have internal processes for really addressing these issues. And as far as we can tell, JBS doesn't. So that, I think, would be our first step. And I think also there's a case to be made that they're in violation of a lot of the pledges around things like deforestation that investment groups have made. So there's an opportunity to continue raising awareness around that to make sure some of the larger institutional investors stay away from their stock.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Before I'm happy to take any other last questions. I did just it's 10:30, so I want to say we can be contacted if you have additional questions, want to follow up. We welcome support for this effort so we can keep it going. You can find us at mightyearth.org. I think we have a slide with details for our media team and other contact information if you can put that up. Just as thanks. Any final thoughts, Caitlin? Briefly.
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, it's been a really fantastic discussion and very inspiring to hear from everyone. So thank you for that. I think it's just really important that we keep the pressure on, right? I mean, this sector has been let off the hook for far too long, and we really need to make sure that greenwashing is cracked down on, that policymakers make sure that these kinds of companies are held to account and that they're not rewarded for this kind of bad climate impact that they're having. So it's really great to be having these discussions to keep the conversation going, and really, really glad to be here with such an inspiring group of people trying to make sure that happens.
Great. Unless there's any other urgent contributions from other panelists, I think we've been able to hear from everybody. Please jump in, but thank you guys. Thanks to everybody who joined. Please do follow up with us. We want to keep this going. As I said, there's a lot at stake, and we need the whole community fighting on it. So thank you.